Use the back of this piece of paper for today's roll. Today is the 11th. Okay, so I've gotten over some of the head cold, and so I managed to get the videos up from the lectures that were not posted yet. So if you're interested in watching them, I just posted the one from Tuesday just now, as I had finished uploading from my computer, so I got that one. If you want to watch yourself as a YouTube star, you're welcome to do that. On Wednesday, so I'm over the head cold, but if I'm walking around like Captain Hook from Peter Pan, it's because I had one of my cats run across the path right in front of me between the stove and the table chasing one of its toys. And as I was about to step, I noticed the cat. My leg went one way, I went the other way, and it's not been a good day since. I fell squarely on the ground. It would have made one of America's Funniest Home Videos if somebody had had a camcorder of me trying to avoid the cat who was attempting to assassinate me. And now I have this distinct limp that I've had for a day now. So if I take enough Advil, I can sort of manage through the pain. But I was losing my voice last week, and this week I'm walking with a limp. So maybe you should stay away from me, because it comes in threes, right? I might actually be accident prone and do something to you. I hope not. We went last time kind of out of order, and we talked about corporate social responsibility because the Super Bowl had just taken place. And I noticed that there were a lot of CSR ads this year in the Super Bowl and in last year's Super Bowl. And so we talked about corporate social responsibility and whether or not that was a good thing and whether or not that was ethical for companies to basically use their money for promoting social causes when it may not have a return on investment. And that's something that is not without controversy. And certainly I told you all that Milton Friedman would say, that's not what we should be doing. Corporations exist to make money, to enrich their shareholders, and that's what you should be focusing on as the bottom line within the confines of the law. That has become a somewhat controversial position in the modern age, but there are still people that ascribe to that. And so in thinking about this and connecting all of these dots, coming back to this idea of modern ethical thought, which we started talking about the week before the Super Bowl and before I decided to sort of get out of order because I thought that was a really good time to talk about corporate social responsibility. And we began talking about utilitarianism. And we talked about Machiavelli and the age of modernity and the prince. Machiavelli never says the ends justify the means in the prince. You can tease that out of the prince, but he never says that formulation. You get that formulation, though, clearly in the ideas of Bentham and Mill. In utilitarianism, Bentham says, the calculus is the greatest happiness principle. And so the purest form of utilitarianism is what we might call act utilitarianism, in which case you have to determine in each and every situation what is going to produce the greatest amount of happiness. And I told you all that this is the one that business students like the most because it has so heavily influenced our economic system in this country. We are a capitalist nation. We're probably the most capitalist nation, although we now have a Democrat socialist running who's beat the major candidate of the Democrat Party in the New Hampshire primaries. Do you think he's going to go on to greater success after New Hampshire?
It's possible.
Is New Hampshire a good predictor of the rest of the nation? Yeah, a lot of times the second place winners in New Hampshire, but it's always been for the last, I think, 12 elections, New Hampshire, whoever's won at least first or second has won the presidency. So you've had to either win first or second. Who does that not bode well for then in the Republican Party? Who won second in New Hampshire? Trump got first place in New Hampshire. Cruz didn't get first place. John Kasich got second place. So it doesn't bode well for the Republican challengers further down the ballot if you look at history as being predictive of the future. So we've got a Democrat-Socialist running, but for the most part, we're a capitalist system, and we've relied heavily on capitalism. And the idea of capitalism is not the maximization of happiness, but the maximization of utility, getting the most bang for your buck. And it's the one that students, because it's the easiest to translate into the moral realm of between these two theories, between capitalism and utilitarianism. It's that very nice, close connection that students rely on. And I think it's also an intuitive way of judging. So in every situation, what you're going to do is you're going to approach the situation, you're going to do a calculus on the situation, and then come up with what is going to be the alternative. So you select from the list of alternatives that you develop based on your analysis of the situation, and select the one that's going to produce the overall greatest good for the greatest number of people. Or in the alternative, if you can't produce good, you've got to do what? What would be the negative of it? Produce the least amount of harm. Sometimes you have situations in which no two alternatives are really good. Let's suppose that there's a major flood, and this happens from time to time in places like California, right, where they have heavy rains that come in. They're in a drought right now, but all the time in the news when they have floods in California during heavy rain season, you'll see these homes that used to be up on the cliffs in California, and they're now no longer on the cliffs, they're washed down to the beach. So you've got a heavy flood, you've got this dam, and the dam operator can flood out. He doesn't have time to warn the people in a nearby village that he's going to have to release water from the dam at such a rate that it would flood them out. But if he doesn't, the dam is going to reach a critical point and break, and that would lead to a catastrophe in which an entire city would be wiped out. There's no good alternative there, but what are you going to do? Are you going to kill the small village, or are you going to let the dam break and flood the city? Yeah, the utilitarian analysis would say you kill the village. That's pretty easy to decide, right? It's not going to be a good decision either way. I mean, the best possible outcome would be that you don't kill anybody, but if you have to decide between killing a small village and killing an entire metropolitan center, it's easy to do the calculus. What could be problematic with that?
If the dam didn't break, if you did let it go for a while, it would reach a critical point.
Okay. You don't know. Maybe the rains will stop and the water will recede and things will turn out peachy. And now you've killed an entire village of people prematurely. That's one of the problems with utilitarianism, is how do you understand the reasonable foreseeability of the acts in which you are going to engage. And that's one of the biggest criticisms of utilitarianism, is that a lot of times we do things and we think that we're going to have good outcomes, and maybe we don't. Maybe the outcomes don't turn out. How many of you have done things in the past where you thought it would have a really good outcome and it didn't turn out so well for you? Can you give me an example?
Just like art projects, really.
You started out and thought it was going to be a masterpiece.
Yeah, and then I'm like, oh, it's awful.
It turned out horrible.
Then you just kind of problem solve your way through it and make it different. It never turns out like how I planned it.
Okay. What about what you all are facing? Something that may be closer to all of your hearts, which is financial security and jobs. It used to be in this country that we would say, if you wanted to achieve middle class status, go to college, get a degree, and you'll get a good job. Is that true today?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. You can go to college. If you don't have a wealthy family, you might amass a substantial amount of debt and come out with that and be worse off than if you had gone into the workforce. A lot of students are saying that. Why should I go and get $100,000 in debt? What is the average undergraduate coming out of college in debt these days?
60 or 50.
I don't think it's 60, I think the average is actually right now about 20, which is not that bad. But if you have no job, and what's the difference between college student loan debt and every other type of debt that you can get, just about? You cannot declare bankruptcy on that debt usually. It takes extreme circumstances before the bankruptcy court will allow you to discharge your student loan debt in bankruptcy. If you go out and charge up a bunch of money on credit cards and you don't have a regular income, you might be able to discharge that debt and they won't even force you into a reorganizational plan under Chapter 13 of the Bankruptcy Code. But it's almost impossible to discharge that student debt. I've seen court cases in which a woman who had gone to college, amassed $60,000 in debt, and was a horrible paranoid schizophrenic and was in and out of mental institutions all of her life, and their doctor wouldn't say that she was absolutely never going to get better, and so her guardian applied for a bankruptcy for her, and the court said because she could get out, in theory, and get a job at some point, she was 46 years old, at some point in the future, we're not discharging the debt on that. So you go into school thinking that this is going to be a great thing, and it may turn out poorly, particularly if you're a musical theater major, or something else that doesn't have a really good marketable skill. So you all have chosen wisely, I think. You've minimized your risk by taking business classes, but that's still not certain. And so my response to that is, if you don't get a college education, your chances become even less that you'll never achieve middle class status. So I still think it's a good risk, but it's entirely possible that you could graduate with a degree, get out, and there will be no jobs, and now you've incurred more debt. And should we say that you're an immoral person because let's suppose that you have to go on welfare assistance that you might not have had to go on because of the debt? If you'd gone out and you'd gotten a job right after high school, maybe you wouldn't have to go on welfare, but now you have to go on food stamps because you've amassed this debt and you've got kids to feed and you can't afford it. Would we say that you're an immoral actor as a result of that decision because it turned out poorly? That's one of the problems with utilitarianism, right? Is that most of us would say, no, you thought you were doing a good thing, and shouldn't you get credit for your planning? And it turned out poorly. I give the example of one of my friends who wanted to buy a car. He had gone with me out to Santa Fe to visit my dad, who lives in Santa Fe. It's a nice home there. And Santa Fe is a pleasant place to visit, particularly in the summers when Oklahoma is 110 and Santa Fe is at 8,000 feet up in the mountains, and the weather is generally about 20 to 30 degrees cooler, and it always drops off at night. It's interesting in Oklahoma that we have frontal passage on average every 3 days here, and that frontal passage in the summer is from south to north, so it's warm fronts that come through from the Gulf of Mexico. And Oklahoma is one of the few places where you can experience the temperature actually rising in the evening, because if we have a front that comes through in the middle of the night, the temperature can actually go up, and it'll be hotter at midnight sometimes than it is during the day here in Oklahoma. That almost never happens in Santa Fe, New Mexico, because of the altitude and the mountains. It's always nice and cool at night. So we went there, and my dad loaned us his Maxima, his Nissan Maxima, and he drove it. He said, this is a really nice car. I need to get a new car soon, and I think I might consider getting this car. My brother had a Nissan Maxima, and he had driven it for 250,000 miles. And so he thought, well, that's a great car. And he did all of this research on Consumer Reports and found that Nissan Maxima had a very good reliability rating. It was the #1 rated car in its class for many, many years. And it had lots of safety features and all of this stuff. And they're kind of fun cars to drive. If you're going to drive a sedan, sedans are just not fun, but the Maxima is actually a fun car to drive. Why is that? It's got a big engine, it's a high-performance car. So it handles more like a sports car, even though it's a sedan. And he went out and he bought it, and from the word go, the car was a nightmare. It turned out to be the one Japanese car that was an absolute limit. And even though it was under warranty, when you're late for meetings and you're an attorney and you're trying to get downtown and the car just automatically shuts off in the middle of I-35, this can be problematic. And it did this a bunch of times, and he finally got rid of the car. It was all still covered under warranty. And he just said, I just want to get rid of the car. He just traded it off. And he got another car, and he said, that was the worst decision I ever made. And I said, that wasn't a bad decision. The results turned out poorly, but you can't necessarily evaluate the quality of the decision based on the results, because you did all the right analysis. If you're going to buy a car, what would be the wrong reasons to buy a car, maybe?
It looks nice.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Color.
I like the color. Yeah, but people do that. They buy emotionally. I want to drive fast and have a sports car, but I've got 2 kids and a wife. You know, probably the Porsche is not the car for you. That would be a bad decision. He didn't make a bad decision. It just, the results didn't end up being so good. And so this is a problem with utilitarianism. And it's one that the second version of utilitarianism attempts to fix for us. So the purest version, the act version of utilitarianism says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to, in every action, we're going to evaluate the situation, analyze it, and come up with the result that will produce the overall greatest goods for the greatest number of people. But as we've seen, this may not be always the best course because things can happen. But in the aggregate of human experience, things are such that maybe we can ascertain patterns that lead to overall greater happiness. Maybe not in a specific instance, but in the overall general population. And so a second form of utilitarianism emerges, which is called rule utilitarianism. And I'll highlight how you can use both rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism in the same way, using something called the prisoner's dilemma, which is from game theory and economics. How many of you have heard of the prisoner's dilemma in economics? So there's a theorist, a mathematician who actually did some work in economics. I think won the Nobel Prize actually in economics for his work on social choice theory in economics. His name was Nash. How many of you have seen the movie called The Brilliant Mind? That's him. He worked on something and came up with an idea called the Nash equilibrium. They talk about that. What?
And he was schizophrenic.
He was paranoid schizophrenic. His dissertation, I've read it, was actually something like 25 pages long. It wasn't very long, but it's all mathematical proofs. And so the prisoner's dilemma is what we call a game. It's game theory. And it's what we call a game of complete but imperfect information. The game is complete because we know what the options are and the outcomes of the game. That's what makes it complete. What makes it imperfect? How can you have a game of complete but imperfect information? The payoffs are going to be prisoner 1 and prisoner 2. Why is the game imperfect?
You don't know what the outcome's going to be.
You don't know what the other player's doing. And thus, you don't necessarily know what the outcomes are going to be. You know what the possible choice outcomes are, but you don't necessarily know what the outcomes are going to be because you don't know what the other player is doing. So it's highlighted by a story. Let's suppose that the police are after 2 suspects that are wanted in connection with a crime. We'll say the crime is burglary. At the common law, burglary was defined as the breaking and entering the dwelling house, which I'll abbreviate as DH, of another in the night. I haven't done this in this class before, have I?
No.
In the night, with intent to commit a felony therein. You have to meet every element of the test in order to be convicted of burglary. This is what lawyers call an elements test as opposed to a factors test. It's hard. You have to meet every single element. You have to break, enter, dwelling house of another in the night with the intent to commit a felony therein.
What about during the day?
Common law, if it was during the day, it wasn't burglary.
What does that make it then?
Maybe something else,
Yeah.
but it wasn't burglary. It had to be in the nighttime. And the reason that they said in the nighttime was that when the common law first started to develop, we were an agricultural society, and so what happened as an agricultural society? Well, men went out to work the fields and women stayed home and worked the house with the children, and they were up and busy during the daytime, running around the house, cleaning, cooking, and things like that with the kids. And so when would you commit the crime of burglary? What do most burglars want to do? What is it they're after? They want to steal stuff so that they can get money, so that they can go buy the cocaine, right? That's the goal. And in the olden days, people were up and around the house during the day, and so you couldn't break in because they would see you, and they would, call to the men in the fields, and they would come. And as we know in Oklahoma, where we have a fascination with guns, they might shoot you, and you can shoot. Now we're not as sophisticated as Texas. In Oklahoma, our Make My Day law says that you have to be in fear for your life or another. In Texas, you may shoot if they're stealing you may shoot if they're breaking in and stealing your property and not presenting a danger to you. You can shoot them. Oh yeah, shoot them in the back. That's great.
Well, no, like they were talking about they want you to get them, like they want to reform and make my day law here in Oklahoma.
Well, in hippy dippy states like New York, there's a requirement that you have to retreat to the wall.
Yeah, see,
So you actually have to run. In Oklahoma, we have what's called we're a stand your ground state, which means you have no duty to retreat. You have no duty to try and avoid the danger. And Texas is far more civilized than we are. Not only do you have no duty to retreat, you can be the aggressor if they're on your property. So in Oklahoma, you can't be the aggressor. You have to you can stand your ground. But in Texas, you can actually be, if they're on your property, you can be the aggressor, as I understand it. Although if you're on their property, you can't do that. And there is a case where a guy was standing, he said, he's calling the police and he's got a pistol and he's out there and he says, I'm standing my ground, and he shot the partygoers, and the Texas jury still convicted him because he was the aggressor and he wasn't on his property. So Texas is a little bit more sophisticated than we are. It's a little bit more of the Wild West there, which makes them highly better than Oklahoma, where we at least say you can't be the aggressor, you can stand your ground though. So it had to be in the nighttime because that's when people would go to bed, and where would you break in? Well, the typical family lived in a farmhouse, or they ran a business out of their property maybe if they lived in the city, and those were usually on the first floor, the ground floor, and the family lived where? On the second floor. And so you'd break in and you'd steal stuff what? On the first floor when everybody's asleep. In the modern era, where we have couples that go off to work and are not around the house during the day, we've reformed this. So the modern rule on burglary is it's no longer the breaking and entering the dwelling house of another. And it doesn't have to be a house, so we do away with this. We just say it has to be the dwelling of another. We do away with in the nighttime with the intent to commit, and we do away with the felony therein and say a crime. So it can be a felony or a misdemeanor. That's the modern rule. So this is the crime that we're going to look at in the prisoner's dilemma. The breaking and entering the dwelling of another with intent to commit a crime therein. The usual crime that you want to commit is you want to steal something so that you can get some money or something of value so that you can pawn it. And you're going to use that to go and support your family or buy the cocaine or whatever it is that you're hopped up on at the time. Now let's suppose that you commit this crime with somebody else. You should never do that. One of my first rules of having practiced criminal law defense is if you're going to commit a crime, never do it with somebody else, because I don't care who they are, they will rat you out. But for the prisoner's dilemma, we have to have two people. It doesn't work with just one person. So you're going to commit the crime with your brother, and I always tell criminals, it doesn't matter that they're your brother. They'll get drunk at Joe's bar and say something to somebody, or when it gets, I mean, blood is not necessarily thicker than water, and they will talk when the time comes. So we have two people that commit a burglary. They break into a house to steal goods with the intent of fleecing the goods so that they can go and they can feed their family. Now let's suppose that they're caught because they take the goods to a pawn shop, and the pawn owner looks, is required to put all of this stuff down. They're required to put a registry of the things that they get, who they get them from, down when they take them in. And the police go by the pawn shop and they look at the records because they're looking for some stolen goods, and you're dumb enough to give them the name of you and your compatriot that went to the pawn shop to fleece the goods. Now the police, you've been smarter than the average criminals in that you didn't leave any physical evidence behind at the crime scene. You wore gloves, nobody was there, you didn't leave any hairs or anything like that. And so what they can get you with is, they can get you with trading stolen property, which is a lesser included maybe offense. And so let's suppose that the penalty for burglary, if they could convict you, would be 7 years. So if you both talk, you're going to get 7 and 7. If you don't talk, they're going to get you for selling or possession and distribution of stolen goods, which will be 3 years. 3 and 3. If one of you talks and the other one remains silent, well, you'll get a slight reduction in your sentence. And so the one that talks will get 4 years and the other one will get 7.
The 3-3
Oh,
should be
sorry.
the bottom.
The 3-3
right?
should be at the bottom right. That's right. Yeah. So this would be 7, 4, 3, 3. Where do you want to end up?
Bottom right,
You want to end up here. Where are you going to end up?
7, 7.
You're going to end up here, top left. Because you don't know what your buddy's doing. The police are going to lie to you. They're going to engage in a lie. They're going to say, your buddy's about to talk. This will be so much easier for you. They're going to arrest you. They're going to put you in separate interrogation rooms. And they're going to say, things will go so much better for you if you'll just tell us what you did. We know you had the property. We know you broke into that house. And of course, for a minute, you're going to use the some dude defense. Where'd you get it? Some dude. Some dude just gave me the property. Some dude just gave me the rings. That was what my clients would always say. Some dude. Your buddy is about to tell us that it's not some dude. They're going to lie to you. Is lying acceptable in this instance?
By lying, you mean?
The police. The police
Oh,
are
okay.
the police are going to lie to you, aren't they?
Yeah.
What's the lie that they're going to tell you?
That
After you come up with the some dude defense,
he's about to rat you.
yeah, they're going to tell you your buddy's about to rat you. The first one to talk is the one that gets the deal,
Mm.
and he's about to break. He's sweating bullets in there, and you're going to talk, aren't you? The thing about utilitarianism is that a lie is never a priori right or wrong. In this instance, the police have acted in such a way as to use the lie to do what?
Draw a confession.
Yeah, to draw a confession from two people, and we're going to send two guys to jail for a lot longer than they would if both of them remained silent. And so the lie is a good thing. But you can't lie to the police, can you? What was Martha Stewart convicted of?
Like tax fraud or something like that?
Money embezzlement?
Dozen.
Lying to a federal agent.
Oh,
She was
yeah.
convicted of one count of lying. They could not prove insider trading. She was convicted of lying to a federal agent. So if you lie to the police, you're going to the hoosgow. That's an old-fashioned term for jail. Paddy wagon is another old-fashioned term that was popular when I was growing up as a kid, and I watched all of the Perry Mason reruns. They would talk about the hoosgow and the paddy wagon. You all have never heard these terms, have you?
No.
So, if you lie to the police, that's bad, because what happens?
You in trouble for lying?
They waste valuable resources chasing leads that may not pan out, that are expensive to obtain, and so it's overall bad. So you can't lie to the police, but the police can lie to you. So in that situation, we determine the calculus by acting in such a way as to allow the police to lie to you to promote the overall greatest happiness. Now, we've talked about the problem that sometimes things don't turn out the way they should, and perhaps things go astray and bad stuff happens, and we can't predict the outcome. So what we'll attempt to do is we'll attempt to come up with rules instead. So we've instituted a rule here. The rule is what? The police can lie to you, you can't lie to the police. Rule utilitarianism. Now, let's think about another law and order example. We'll call it the hypothetical of the serial murderer. Let's suppose that a police officer knows the identity beyond a shadow of doubt in his mind of a serial killer. But he knows that there's not enough evidence to convict the serial killer because serial killers generally tend to be fairly smart. By the way, the number of serial killers in the overall killer population is very, very little. Murderers actually have the lowest recidivism rate of any criminal in the criminal justice system, if it's just murder, if it's not murder coupled with another crime. When you disaggregate just murderers, they have a very low recidivism rate. Why is that? Murder is a crime of passion. Murder is generally, it's a fight and something goes wrong between a husband and a wife or between siblings. Usually the vast majority of people who are murdered in this country are murdered by somebody that they know. And so they have very low recidivism rates compared to other criminals. But as long as it's not coupled with an armed robbery. If you say, well, it was a murder that occurred in the middle of an armed robbery, well then the recidivism rate, that doesn't work out. But a lot of times murders have very low recidivism rates because it's a crime of passion. The exception is serial killers. They're the ones that are going to do it again. And they generally tend to be highly functioning and highly intellectually capable people. Maybe bent, but they tend to be fairly smart. That's the way they get away with it for so long. So the case against the serial killer is circumstantial, but he's pretty sure. Because the guy has all but confessed to him, but it's not been said when he's been Mirandized, and there are all these problems with the context, and there was no witnesses, and so he knows that the guy's going to go free if he tries to arrest him because he's going to get off on a technicality. The officer in that case, in an act utilitarian world, would be justified in doing what? Killing the killer. Engaging in the judge dread option. Now in this instance, this is going to produce the overall greatest happiness because we're going to remove a serial killer. We're not going to waste resources on trying him, providing him with a lawyer and all of the appeals that will go along with it that he's going to get once he is convicted. And we're going to take care of the problem. But we generally say that's not a good thing, right? The police shouldn't engage in vigilante justice. For those of you who have seen the movie Judge Dredd, did we talk about that in here? What happens in the movie Judge Dredd? How many of you have seen that movie? One person has seen it. They had a remake of it.
Yeah.
What happens in Judge Dredd?
He enforces the law. He takes it into his own hands. pretty
It's
much.
not, it doesn't take the hit, they're authorized.
Yeah.
This is what we call a dystopian world, a dark world, or a dark utopian
They follow the
worldview.
law.
What are some of the classic dystopians or dark utopians that you probably had to read? 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451. Those are sort of classics. I'm amazed at what my students tell me that they didn't have to read. How many of you had to read 1984 in high school? Okay, some of you. How many of you didn't have to read 1984? What did you read in high school?
We read A Brave New World and Fahrenheit.
I don't remember.
You don't remember? It's amazing to me, one of my students said, we didn't read that. In American literature class, we read Jackie Collins. And I was taken aback because there are two problems with that. A, she's not American, and B, she's trash. I mean, it's trashy love novels. It's not great literature. But whatever, you know, this new method of teaching, where they don't actually teach in high school, I guess is okay. So, in Judge Dredd, the judge, or the police are the judge, jury, and executioner. And what ends up happening in that dark utopian world? Well, people do what? If the police officer is going to smite you right there, what happens to the people and the citizens in this world? They become naturally skeptical of the police, don't they? And if we thought police were doing this over and over again, we would become naturally skeptical of the police. The Mexican government has now told their own people that they should fear their national police because they're so corrupt. That's the kind of world you would live in if you thought that that's what was going to happen to you. And so what the rule utilitarian would say is, we need to remove this. Although, in this absolute sense, if the officer commits the crime of murder against the serial killer, he's promoting overall greater happiness. In the aggregate, that may not work. Because in this dystopian novel that we have with Judge Dredd, we see what happens. People don't trust the police. And therefore, it's more chaotic than it would be. So what we'll do is we'll develop rules that will say, so we say things like, even though it's expensive, even though the criminal justice system is costly and it's slow, you don't engage in vigilante justice. We'll develop rules to deal with these problems. What are the rules? Well, the rules are the police have to abide by code of evidence. They can't do these things. We have judges and juries that determine whether or not you go to jail and whether or not you're killed. So we'll develop rules that will allow us to promote the overall greatest happiness. And this goes along hand in hand with Hobbes' social contract that we talked about. This is the Hobbesian worldview. And it is the psychological egoist, or psychological egoism, or ethical egoism's theory, is that what we'll do is we'll channel these things into rules that promote overall the best possible outcomes. There's a second problem with utilitarianism. Now again, what makes an ethical theory valid? What are the three things that make it valid? Based on rational analysis. I did talk about this, didn't I? Based on rational analysis, what? Allows for the development of universal rules or principles based on that analysis, and allows for no exceptionalism. Utilitarianism is valid because it allows us to produce, we do the calculus, we're going to weigh the options, come up with an analysis of solutions, and then select a solution that produces the overall greatest happiness. But there's another problem in doing this, right? There's first the foreseeability problem that we talked about. And the foreseeability problem can be highlighted by the Falls graph case. Did we talk about the Long Island Railroad versus Fallscraft?
I don't believe
So,
so.
the foreseeability problem, another example of this problem is highlighted by the requirement in tort law that when you sue somebody for a tort, there has to be this temporal aspect to the causation. So, tort relies on duty, breach of duty by the defendant, duty, breach of duty, injury to the plaintiff, and then there's causation, which is both cause and fact and proximate. So Mrs. Fallscraft is standing on a railroad platform, and a man is running to catch a train. He starts to drop a package as he steps onto the train because the train is moving away from the platform. The package contains explosives. An usher from the train company pushes him. He drops the package of explosives on the train track. The sound concussion from the explosives causes some scales to fall off a wall and hit Mrs. Fallscraft in the head. Now, but for the act of the usher pushing this man onto the train, Mrs. Fallscraft wouldn't have been injured. She sues the railroad company. Why does she sue the railroad company?
Because they have those.
They have more money. They have deep pockets. She sues the railroad company because they have deep pockets, and they're the ones that are going to be able to pay. The guy who's carrying the explosives, you know, well, he may have been dead or injured, so you're going to sue the person. And the court says, well, but for the act of the push, she wouldn't have been hurt, but it's too attenuated. That's not reasonably foreseeable. It's not the proximate cause. Because if you allowed just for causation by the but-for test, you could have an infinite series of regresses, and you could find a whole lot of people liable. You know, but for the fact that her mother birthed her, she wouldn't have been born and injured. Right? You have this whole series of infinite regresses that you could have. So you have cause and fact and approximate cause. So, and again, this is an elements test that you have to achieve in order to be guilty of this test. And what rule utilitarianism attempts to fix are these two problems. This idea of reasonably foreseeable. So we don't always know what's going to happen in the future, but if we develop rules that in the aggregate produce the overall greatest happiness, won't that be wonderful? And it eliminates the calculus problem. What do I mean by the calculus problem? Well, how do you calculate? Or it attempts to eliminate the calculus problem. How do you calculate? What are we going to do to achieve the overall greatest happiness?
Guidelines.
Well, how do we do that in certain situations? Let's think about this situation. For those of you who've heard this analogy before, I apologize because you've heard it in my sales class or you've heard it in my principles class. We'll do the hypothetical of the Titanic. How many of you have been to Branson, Missouri? I'm amazed. Why did you all go to Branson? Aren't you, isn't this a little young crowd to be going to Branson?
Family reunions.
Isn't the average age of the person who goes to Branson about 105? They have acts there that you have never heard of before. Well, Dolly Parton doesn't actually perform in Branson. she has the Dolly Parton Stampede or review. And it's amazing. Other than the fact that they don't let you have liquor there, it's a rockin' good time. They've got women in dresses that light up. Yeehaw. And horses. What could be better than that? So you go to Branson and they have this exhibit there called the Titanic. They built this museum that looks like the Titanic. It's really incredible. And when you buy the tickets for the museum, what is your ticket?
You're a person.
It's a boarding pass with a name on it. It's one of the names of the actual passengers on the Titanic. I've done this 3 times. And at the end of the museum, you get to see what? Whether you lived or died. All 3 times I've been very fortunate I have lived. I've always been a first-class passenger who made it onto the life rafts. Well, we're on the Titanic, you and me. We've seen the picture, we know how this is going to go down. The skinny little kid is going to drop at the bottom of the ocean when, what was her name, Rose?
Yeah.
Actually lets, I'll never let go. She actually lets go and pushes him off. She lives and he doesn't.
That's how it's gonna fit.
Huh?
That's how it's gonna fit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he bites the bullet, goes to the bottom, but we're lucky. We made it onto the life rafts. But now there's another problem. About to run out of time for my camcorder. So I'm going to switch to streaming it and recording it on my mobile device. We'll see how well this transition goes. So I've switched from recording it on the SD card to now it's supposedly recording on my phone. Hopefully this will work. I'm not sure about this, but we'll see. I've had technology failures with this system in the past, but hope springs eternal that it will work this time. So we're on this lifeboat, and there's you and there's me. There's Mother Teresa. There's Donald Trump. There's some smelly guy named Bob who smells of soured milk because, in the words of Eric Cartman, "Why people tend to live in yesterdays." And we're taking on water. And we look down, and it says maximum capacity, 4 people, and how many do we have? We have 5. There's you, me, Mother Teresa. Who else did I say? Donald Trump
And Bob.
and Bob. Who are we going to get rid of? Donald Trump? Now, come on, we can't get rid of Donald. I mean, he's built a beautiful company. He's built a beautiful company. He employs millions of people. And he's going to build a beautiful wall.
If we save him, he'll give us a small loan.
What?
If we save him, he'll give us a small loan.
Yeah, I mean, you're gonna vote off the guy whose hair looks like it's 2 squirrels in a cage fight on top of his head, dueling squirrels. That's who you're gonna get rid of? Huh?
I said maybe we'll just get rid of these, whatever it is.
You can't get rid of Donald. Who's gonna provide the entertainment? Mother Teresa, of course, volunteers. She says, "I'll take one for the team."
Doesn't matter.
What? Oh, come on, people. No. No, we're not going to let Mother Teresa down, are we? The woman is a saint. These people don't come along every day. You're going to need them when we get back.
Smelly Bob.
There's you and me. Well, you look over. We've all heard the jokes. What's the difference between a dead skunk on the road and a dead lawyer on the road? There are skid marks in front of the skunk. What do you call 1,000 lawyers at the bottom of the ocean? A good start. So, well, let's get rid of Aguirre. Oh, come on, although I've spent a good portion of my life as a litigator, I've also come down here, taught this class, formed young minds. 26 of my students that I've written letters of recommendation for have gone on to law school and have become lawyers in the Oklahoma bar. Isn't that worth something? I've got one that's about to pass the New Mexico bar now. That'll make 27. Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm even more dangerous. Yeah, I'm creating more moral hazard here. So definitely throw. Well, now let's not throw me in. What about you? You're not lawyers. Are you creating overall net worth? Maybe. How many of you are a net negative right now? Living at home, sucking off your parents. Maybe we should throw you over. Bob. Let's get rid of Bob. Do you see what we're doing here? We're performing the calculus on a human life. How do you determine? How do you judge? How do you decide? How do you say that man's life is worth less than that one's? How do you measure that? I don't know. I mean, it's creepy. Now, you want to do it, there's a science. We have the only program in the state that offers it. Here at UCO, it's called actuarial science, and they measure, they calculate risk and value. They tell you things like this person's worth, a brain surgeon's worth more than a lawyer, much to my horror. They tell you that. But it's creepy, isn't it? It's just creepy. Maybe we shouldn't do it. And that's one of the biggest problems. But utilitarianism, it does force us to use reason. It is based on logic. It allows for no exceptionalism, and we can develop these universal principles. But I think it's something that we really ought to think about, whether or not we should start doing these kinds of calculations on things. So, in opposition to utilitarianism, we might have deontological ethics or duty-based ethics. Utilitarianism is what we call a teleological based ethics because it focuses on the telos, or the ends. That's the telos is the Greek word for ends. The ends justify the means, according to Mill. Duty ethics, on the other hand, says we can't look at the ends, because we don't know what the ends are going to be necessarily. What we have to do is we have to ascertain a priori duties, and then we impose these duties and follow through with them, because the results can't matter. As the car example highlights, you can do the calculus, make a good judgment, and bad things can still happen. The results don't count in ethics. Now, the question is, where are these duties going to come from? How are we going to ascertain them? Well, cultural relativists, and there's a version of cultural relativism that's called legal positivism, would say, well, we ascertain them from the law. And so a lot of people will say in a lot of textbooks, and the older version of your textbook actually said this, said the law is an acceptable moral minimum. And legal positivists would say it's not just an acceptable moral minimum, it is the morality. The problem with that argument is that what? What could be wrong with saying the law is morality?
There might be exceptions.
Huh?
There might be exceptions.
There might be exceptions to the law? Okay, there's always exceptions, but we can deal with those.
Everybody interprets it differently.
Less so than other things though, right? What are we gonna do? We're gonna go to the book. We're gonna look at the book. And to a greater or lesser extent, we as a society define ourselves by the laws that we pass to criminalize people. We define who we are as a nation by what we criminalize. So, for years and years and years, almost every state in this nation had anti-sodomy laws that applied to homosexuals. That was the law of the land. In Bowers versus Hardwick in 1986, Chief Justice Warren E. Burger said that to not allow the state to impose sodomy laws would violate 5 millennia of moral teaching. So we criminalized that behavior. We defined ourselves by that as a society. Was that moral?
From his perspective, maybe.
What?
From his perspective, maybe.
The law said it was. The law said that was morality, if you're a legal positivist, that's morality.
I think that those laws, like some laws are like old time, like marriage laws, like gay right laws, like some people think those are just like old time laws and that they need to be.
Yeah, from 1986 to 2015, which was the year that we got the Obergefell decision, a lot changed. Should we base morality on the law? In 1856, in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, after the Civil War, we get 3 amendments to the United States Constitution. The 13th Amendment frees the slaves. The 14th Amendment contains one of 2 due process clauses found in the document, in the United States Constitution. And it contains the first equal protection clause in the document. There was not an equal protection clause before the 14th Amendment. There is a due process clause found in the 5th Amendment to the United States Constitution, the 2nd in the 14th Amendment, and the first equal protection and only equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment gave the freedmen the right to vote. In 1856 in Plessy versus Ferguson, the question before the court was whether or not, given the equal protection clause of the United States Constitution, the states could segregate people on the classification of racial basis. And the court says you can, that it doesn't violate equal protection. Doesn't violate the Equal Protection Clause. As long as you have roughly equal facilities for the races, you can segregate them. This led to Jim Crow legislation throughout the American South that denied African Americans most of their civil dignity. In all places, everything was segregated. Railway cars, buses, water fountains, restaurants, hotels, theaters, swimming pools, school systems. All of that was segregated. That was the law. That was a law. In 1954, a case comes before the United States Supreme Court after a series of decisions, one of which involved Oklahoma. The NAACP began to challenge these laws as being unconstitutional because they didn't provide absolute equality. And Oklahoma was one of the cases. We had an African American institution of higher education called Langston, which is 13 miles from my home in Guthrie to the east, but we didn't have a law school. And Ada Louise Cethiel Fisher wanted to go to law school. And the state of Oklahoma didn't have a law school. The only law school that the state provided was at OU. She sued the state of Oklahoma, the NAACP, so that she could go to law school. And Oklahoma said, well, what we'll do is we'll let you go to law school somewhere else and we'll pay for it. There were historically black, what we call HBCs, HBCSs, historically black colleges and schools, and other places that had law schools. And that was the choice that her brother decided to take. She decided not to. She decided to fight the state of Oklahoma, and the case went to the United States Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, no, equal protection means equal protection. You've got to provide it with a law school. So they formed a law school. It was in the basement of the Oklahoma State Capitol. Had no library, no faculty. They said, that's not going to do it. So they had to admit her to OU law. They roped off the back of the classroom so that she could sit separately from the other students. That was the law. Brown versus Board of Education would have gone 5-4 in favor of sustaining Plessy versus Ferguson, but for one unique fact. And this is, when we talk about environmental scanning, I use this as an example of how regulatory, one of the things that we talk about in an environmental scan is the regulatory environment and how that impacts the social environment, the technological environment, the economic environment. So we look at these factors: economic, technological, social, regulatory, in an environmental scan. And Fred Vinson is the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And they hear Brown versus Board of Education, and it's going to be 5-4, with Vinson in the majority voting to sustain Plessy versus Ferguson. A man named William Rehnquist, by the way, was a law clerk for a guy named Stanley Reed at the time. William Rehnquist later went on to serve as Chief Justice of the United States. He was the last Chief Justice before the one we currently have. He died in office. And we got John Roberts appointed after William Rehnquist died. William Rehnquist wrote a brief for his justice at the time that he was serving as law clerk that said that Plessy versus Ferguson had been rightly decided and that the rights of the minority were always going to be subject to the rights of the majority, and that's just the way it was. Plessy versus Ferguson was right and should be sustained. That man was Chief Justice. The man who wrote that brief was Chief Justice of the United States. until 2006 when he finally bit the dust. Earl Warren had been governor of the great state of California, and he wanted to run. He'd run for vice president, he wanted to run for president. Dwight David Eisenhower says, if you don't run and you throw your support to me, I'll give you the first appointment on the Supreme Court that comes open. Warren takes the deal. California's a big state. The way you get the nomination to become a party's nominee for president is you get delegates. California has a lot of them. You would have pulled a lot of delegates away from Eisenhower. Fred Vinson dies. Earl Warren goes to Eisenhower and says, I want my appointment. And Eisenhower says, I didn't mean the chief's job. I meant an associate job. And he said, no, he said the first one. And so Brown is re-argued. And a remarkable thing happens. By the sheer magnitude of this individual, he goes to, the decision is now going to be 5-4 in favor of overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. And he goes to all of those justices on the minority, and he says, this is going to happen, and we need to speak with a unanimous voice. The last holdout is Stanley Reed. And he goes to Stan and he says, Stan, you're all alone in this now. You're all alone in this. Are you willing to damage the reputation of the court to sustain your position? And he gets Stanley Reed to change his mind. The shift is radical. And in a book called A Consumer's Republic, by Elizabeth Cohen, she details how this kind of movement impacted the consumer market. We got shopping malls, you can maybe argue, as a result of, you used to go downtown to buy all sorts of stuff. And when integration happens, it affects the retailing industry because they all move out of downtown as a result of white flight and suburbanization. And so they move to these centers where they build these malls. The retailers cluster together. My point is that if you're relying on legal positivism in the law itself may be immoral. The law itself may be immoral. And are we willing to say that Martin Luther King was an immoral man because he disobeyed the law? Or are we going to say that the law itself was wrong? Most of us would say the law was wrong. We can't rely on the law. So there's another alternative that we can come up with. It's called religious absolutism. Now this one is maybe even more problematic than relying on the law, because it's going to rely on the what? It's going to rely on the book. Whose book are we going to rely on? That's a good place to stop. We'll then talk about rational absolutism next time.